Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Tonight, we dive into the haunting disappearance of 20-year-old Heather Elvis, who vanished without a trace in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in December 2013. What began as a promising night, returning home from a first date, would spiral into one of the most disturbing cases in South Carolina history. Her abandoned car discovered at a remote boat landing, a mysterious late-night phone call from a Walmart payphone, and at the center of it all, a married couple consumed by jealousy over an affair that had ended months earlier. Though Sydney and Tammy Mora would eventually be convicted of kidnapping, Heather's body has never been found, leaving her family in an agonizing limbo between grief and hope. Tonight, we follow the evidence trail that led investigators through this twisted case of obsession, deception, and ultimately, justice without closure. Let's unravel the mystery of what happened that December night in 2013. I'll never forget the first time I heard about Heather Elvis. It was December 2013, and the holiday season was in full swing across the United States. Christmas lights adorned homes, festive music played in every store, and families were making plans to celebrate together. But in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, one family was about to experience the beginning of a nightmare that continues to this day. Heather Elvis was just 20 years old when she disappeared in the early morning hours of December 18, 2013. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her, a life that was showing real promise. She had recently landed a job as a hostess at the Tilted Kilt, a local restaurant in Myrtle Beach. She was passionate about cosmetology and had dreams of building a career in that field. Those who knew her described Heather as vibrant, friendly, and full of life, someone who lit up a room when she walked in. The events leading up to Heather's disappearance began innocuously enough. On December 17th, she went on a first date with a man named Stephen Schiraldi. By all accounts, the date went well. Stephen later told investigators that he and Heather had gone to a bar called Banditos, followed by a drive along the Myrtle Beach waterfront. He dropped her off at her apartment at the River Oaks Drive complex around 1:15 a.m. on December 18th. Security footage would later confirm his account, showing Heather arriving home safely. What happened after Heather arrived home is where things become murky, and where the case takes a disturbing turn. When Heather failed to show up for work later that day, her co-workers became concerned. It wasn't like her to miss a shift without calling. Her roommate, Brianna Worrellman, hadn't seen her either. Heather's car, a dark green 2001 Dodge Intrepid, was also missing from their apartment complex. Growing increasingly worried, Brianna contacted Heather's father, Terry Elvis. Terry immediately began searching for his daughter. On December 19th, he filed a missing person report with the Horry County Police Department. Later that same day, police located Heather's car. It was found abandoned at Peachtree Landing, a boat landing site along the Waccamaw River, about 8 miles from her apartment. The keys were not in the ignition. Her purse and phone were nowhere to be found. There was no sign of Heather. The discovery of her abandoned car at a remote boat landing sent shockwaves through the community and intensified fears about what might have happened to the young woman. Peachtree Landing would become central to the investigation, a silent witness to whatever transpired that night. As investigators began piecing together Heather's final known movements, they obtained her phone records. What they discovered was troubling. After being dropped off by Stephen, Heather had received a phone call at 1:35 a.m. from a payphone located at a Walmart not far from her apartment. The call lasted just 4 minutes. Following this mysterious call, Heather's phone showed activity that suggested she was on the move. Cell tower pings placed her phone traveling toward Peachtree Landing in the early morning hours of December 18th. Her last phone activity was recorded at 3:41 a.m. when her phone pinged a tower near the boat landing where her car would later be discovered. Who had called Heather from that payphone? And why would she drive to a remote boat landing in the middle of the night? These questions would soon lead investigators down a path that would uncover a tangled web of relationships, jealousy, and potentially deadly obsession. As police dug deeper into Heather's life, they learned of a complicated relationship she had been involved in earlier that year. Heather had been romantically involved with a man named Sidney Mora, who worked as a maintenance worker at the Tilted Kilt where she was employed. There was just one significant problem with this relationship. Sidney was married to Tammy Mora, and the couple had 3 children together. The affair between Heather and Sidney had begun in June 2013 and continued for several months before ending in October of that year. According to friends of Heather, the breakup had been difficult for her. She had genuinely fallen for Sidney, who was 38 at the time, nearly twice her age. What made this relationship particularly relevant to the investigation was the aftermath of the breakup. According to multiple witnesses, including Heather's friends and co-workers, Tammy Mora had discovered the affair and was furious. Witnesses reported that Tammy had begun harassing Heather with threatening phone calls and text messages. She allegedly forced Sidney to call Heather on speakerphone while she listened, making him tell Heather that he didn't want anything to do with her anymore. The harassment reportedly became so severe that Heather considered filing a restraining order against the Moras, but never followed through. Friends stated that Heather had been trying to move on with her life, which included her date with Stephen Schiraldi on the night before she disappeared. As investigators continued to unravel the connections between Heather and the Moras, they made a critical discovery. Video surveillance from the Walmart showed a black Ford F-150 truck pulling up to the payphone at the exact time the call was made to Heather's phone at 1:35 a.m. on December 18th. The truck matched one owned by the Moras. When questioned about his whereabouts on the night of Heather's disappearance, Sidney Mora initially denied making any calls to her. However, when confronted with the video evidence, he changed his story. He admitted to calling Heather from the payphone, but claimed he only did so because Tammy had asked him to call and tell Heather to leave them alone. He insisted that was the extent of his contact with Heather that night. But cell phone records told a different story. After receiving the call from the payphone, Heather made 3 calls to Sidney's phone between 3:17 a.m. and 3:21 a.m. Calls that Sidney initially failed to disclose to investigators. The investigation took another turn when police obtained surveillance footage from businesses along the routes between the Mora's home in Socastee and Peachtree Landing. This footage captured a black Ford F-150 matching the Mora's truck traveling toward Peachtree Landing around 3:30 a.m. on December 18th, and then returning in the opposite direction around 3:45 a.m. These timestamps aligned disturbingly well with the final ping from Heather's phone at 3:41 a.m. near the boat landing. As if these coincidences weren't damning enough, investigators discovered that both Sidney and Tammy Mora had gone to extraordinary lengths to establish alibis for the night of December 17th, 18. They had receipts showing they had been shopping at Walmart, Kangaroo Express, and Seaboard Street businesses during the evening hours. However, there was a gap in their documented whereabouts that coincided with the critical hours between approximately 2:30 a.m. and 4 a.m., precisely when Heather's phone was moving toward Peachtree Landing and when the black truck was captured on surveillance cameras. Further investigation into the Moras' activities revealed that in the days following Heather's disappearance, they had made unusual purchases, including several large containers of cleaning supplies. They also began cleaning their truck inside and out, behavior that investigators found suspicious. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that the Moras had purchased a pregnancy test kit on December 18th, the day of Heather's disappearance. This purchase raised questions about whether Heather might have been pregnant with Sidney's child, a potential motive that would later be explored in court, though no concrete evidence of a pregnancy was ever established. As the investigation intensified, the Moras' behavior became increasingly erratic. They refused to cooperate fully with police and eventually stopped speaking to investigators altogether on the advice of their attorneys. They also began posting cryptic and sometimes taunting messages on social media, which many interpreted as being directed at Heather's family and the investigators. In one particularly disturbing incident, Tammy Mora allegedly posted a photo of herself and Sydney on Facebook with the caption, "We're in love and nothing can change that," on December 20th, just 2 days after Heather went missing, and amid growing public awareness of their potential involvement in her disappearance. The couple's home in Socastee became the focus of intense scrutiny. On February 21st, 2014, police executed a search warrant on the property. They seized computers, phones, vacuum cleaners, and other items that might contain forensic evidence. During this search, both Sydney and Tammy Mora were arrested. Sydney was initially charged with obstruction of justice and indecent exposure, the latter charge stemming from an unrelated incident. Tammy was charged with obstruction of justice. But on February 24, 2014, the charges against both were upgraded dramatically. Sydney and Tammy Mora were both charged with murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of indecent exposure. The indecent exposure charges were later dropped, but the murder and kidnapping charges remained. Prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to prove that the Moras had conspired to lure Heather to Peachtree Landing, where they kidnapped and killed her, though her body has never been found. The case against the Moras was largely circumstantial but compelling. The timeline of events, the phone records, the video surveillance, and their suspicious behavior after Heather's disappearance all pointed toward their involvement. Prosecutors theorized that Tammy's jealousy over Heather's affair with Sydney had escalated to the point of violence. But without a body, the case would prove challenging to prosecute. In March 2016, in a surprising turn of events, the murder charges against both Sydney and Tammy Mora were dropped due to lack of evidence. However, the kidnapping charges remained and the legal proceedings continued. Sydney Mora was the first to stand trial for kidnapping in June 2016. The prosecution presented their timeline theory, the video evidence of the truck, the phone records, and testimony from witnesses about the hostile relationship between the Moras and Heather following the affair. One particularly damning piece of evidence was testimony from a former cellmate of Sydney's, who claimed that Sydney had confessed to him that if they didn't find the body, they didn't have a case. The defense dismissed this as jailhouse hearsay from an unreliable witness seeking favorable treatment. After a week-long trial, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial. Sydney Mora remained free on bond, but still faced the kidnapping charge, which prosecutors vowed to retry. In the meantime, Sydney was tried and convicted on the obstruction of justice charge in August 2017. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for lying to police about his contact with Heather on the night she disappeared. In October 2018, Sydney Mora was retried for kidnapping. This time, the prosecution presented additional evidence, including testimony that Sydney had shown a pattern of calling Heather repeatedly in the weeks before her disappearance. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Tammy Mora's kidnapping trial began in October 2018. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and rage over her husband's affair with Heather. They presented evidence of Tammy's obsessive behavior, including text messages she had sent to friends discussing Heather and the affair in graphic and angry terms. Multiple witnesses testified that Tammy had been fixated on Heather, constantly monitoring her social media accounts and forcing Sydney to call her repeatedly. One witness even testified that Tammy had forced Sydney to get a tattoo of her name above his groin as a way to mark her territory after discovering the affair. Perhaps the most shocking testimony came from witnesses who claimed that Tammy had boasted about assaulting Heather. According to these witnesses, Tammy had described confronting Heather at Peachtree Landing and seeing the fear in her eyes before she took care of her. The defense attempted to discredit these witnesses, suggesting they were lying to gain favorable treatment in their own legal troubles, or were simply repeating rumors. They also emphasized the lack of physical evidence directly linking Tammy to Heather's disappearance. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for about 4 hours before finding Tammy Mora guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite these convictions, the most fundamental question in the case remains unanswered. What happened to Heather Elvis? Where is her body? The Moras maintain their innocence, insisting they had nothing to do with her disappearance. Heather's family continues to search for answers and closure. Law enforcement has conducted numerous searches of the areas around Peachtree Landing and the Waccamaw River, utilizing dive teams, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Heather has ever been found. Some investigators believe her body may have been disposed of in the Waccamaw River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean. If true, the currents may have carried her remains out to sea, making recovery nearly impossible. Others speculate that the Moras may have hidden her body in a remote location that has yet to be discovered. The case has generated intense public interest, with numerous podcasts, documentaries, and television shows examining the evidence and theories. It has also sparked heated debates about the justice system's ability to successfully prosecute murder cases without a body. For Heather's family, particularly her parents Terry and Debbie Elvis, the pain of not knowing what happened to their daughter is a constant burden. They have become advocates for missing persons and have worked tirelessly to keep Heather's case in the public eye. Not having her body, not having that closure, it's like living in a perpetual state of limbo, Terry Elvis said in a 2019 interview. We can't properly grieve because there's always that small hope that maybe, just maybe, she's still out there somewhere. The Heather Elvis case highlights the devastating impact that a missing person case has on families and communities. It also demonstrates the complexity of prosecuting cases based largely on circumstantial evidence. While the judicial system has determined that Sydney and Tammy Mora were responsible for kidnapping Heather, the full truth about what happened in the early morning hours of December 18, 2013, may never be known unless one of the Moras decides to break their silence. As the years pass, the likelihood of finding Heather's remains diminishes, but her family refuses to give up hope for answers. They continue to hold vigils at Peachtree Landing on the anniversary of her disappearance, keeping her memory alive and reminding the public that their search for the truth continues. The case also serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly life can change. One moment, Heather was a young woman returning home from a promising first date, looking forward to the future. The next, she vanished, leaving behind a mystery that continues to haunt her loved ones and the community of Myrtle Beach. For investigators, the case remains technically open. Although the Moras have been convicted of kidnapping, the murder charges were dropped, and without Heather's body, proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt presented too great a challenge for prosecutors. In the years since Heather's disappearance, there have been occasional rumors and tips about her whereabouts, but none have led to significant breakthroughs. Some have suggested that the Moras may have had accomplices who helped dispose of Heather's body, while others believe the couple acted alone. The case has also raised questions about how law enforcement handles missing persons cases, particularly those involving young women. Some critics have suggested that police could have acted more quickly in the initial stages of the investigation, potentially preserving evidence that might have led to Heather's recovery. However, the Horry County Police Department has defended its handling of the case, pointing to the extensive resources dedicated to finding Heather and bringing those responsible for her disappearance to justice. The investigation involved multiple agencies, including the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, underscoring the seriousness with which authorities treated the case. As we reflect on the disappearance of Heather Elvis, it's impossible not to wonder what might have been. Her friends describe a young woman with a bright future, someone who was kind, creative, and determined to make something of her life. Her absence leaves a void that can never be filled. The legal saga of the Heather Elvis case continued to unfold in the years following the convictions of Sydney and Tammy Mora. Both defendants filed appeals, attempting to overturn their kidnapping convictions. Sydney's appeal was denied by the South Carolina Court of Appeals in 2020, effectively upholding his 30-year sentence. Tammy's appeal process followed a similar path, with courts consistently maintaining her conviction. What makes this case particularly heartbreaking is the lack of closure for Heather's family. Terry and Debbie Elvis have had to navigate not only the grief of losing their daughter, but also the unique pain of not knowing where her remains are located. They've been denied the basic human comfort of properly laying their child to rest. Every day I wake up wondering if today will be the day we find her, Terry Elvis said during a community vigil marking the 5-year anniversary of Heather's disappearance. No parent should have to live like this. Not knowing is its own special kind of torture. The Elvis family has channeled their grief into advocacy work. They established the Find Heather Elvis organization, which has evolved beyond the search for their daughter to become a resource for families of other missing persons. They regularly participate in awareness events and have worked with lawmakers to strengthen legislation related to missing persons cases. In 2018, partly inspired by Heather's case, South Carolina passed legislation that increased penalties for tampering with electronic monitoring devices. This was relevant because during the investigation, there had been questions about potential tampering with tracking data from the Mora's phones and vehicles. The community of Myrtle Beach has not forgotten Heather. Each December, on the anniversary of her disappearance, supporters gather at Peachtree Landing for a candlelight vigil. The site has become an unofficial memorial, with many visitors leaving flowers, notes, and mementos throughout the year. What was once just a boat landing on the Waccamaw River has become hallowed ground for those who remember Heather and continue to hope for answers. Law enforcement has conducted periodic searches of the area over the years, sometimes prompted by new tips or information, other times as part of routine follow-up. In 2017, a particularly extensive search was conducted using advanced sonar equipment to scan deeper sections of the river, but like previous efforts, it yielded no results. One of the most difficult aspects of the case for investigators has been the sheer number of potential disposal sites in the area. The coastal region around Myrtle Beach is characterized by extensive waterways, swamps, and wooded areas that could potentially conceal remains indefinitely. The Waccamaw River itself flows into Winyah Bay and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean, creating the possibility that evidence could have been carried miles from the original site. The case has generated significant debate among legal experts about the challenges of prosecuting kidnapping and murder cases without recovering a victim's body. Such no-body homicides, as they're sometimes called, rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and often face higher hurdles to conviction. Professor Colin Miller, a criminal law expert at the University of South Carolina School of Law, has commented on the case. The Heather Elvis case demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of prosecuting cases without a body. The state was able to secure kidnapping convictions based on a strong circumstantial case, but felt they couldn't meet the higher burden for murder charges. It's a delicate balance between seeking justice and recognizing the evidentiary challenges. The circumstantial evidence against the Moores was indeed substantial. Beyond what was presented at their trials, investigators had compiled a troubling pattern of behavior and statements that pointed to their involvement. For instance, in the weeks following Heather's disappearance, Tammy Mora had conducted numerous internet searches related to how phone records could be used in criminal investigations and how to permanently delete information from electronic devices. She had also researched boat trips to certain countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Sidney's behavior was equally suspicious. In addition to lying about his contact with Heather on the night she vanished, he was observed on security footage purchasing large quantities of cleaning supplies in the days after her disappearance. When their home was searched, investigators found that portions of their house and truck had been cleaned with unusual thoroughness. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports from multiple witnesses about Tammy's obsession with Heather. According to testimony presented at trial, Tammy had created multiple fake social media accounts to monitor Heather's online activities. She had allegedly forced Sidney to call Heather repeatedly while she listened in, sometimes demanding that he say cruel things to her. One witness, a former friend of Tammy's, testified that Tammy had shown an almost manic fixation on Heather, spending hours scrolling through her social media posts and making derogatory comments about her appearance and lifestyle. According to this witness, Tammy had once stated that she would rather kill Heather than let her have Sidney. The case has also highlighted the complex dynamics of domestic relationships and how they can spiral into dangerous territory. Forensic psychologists who have studied the case suggest it represents a textbook example of what can happen when jealousy evolves into obsession and potentially violence. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychology professor who has written extensively about similar cases, noted, "What we see in the Heather Elvis case is a pattern of escalating behavior. What began as monitoring and harassment allegedly progressed to confrontation and potentially violence. These cases rarely erupt suddenly. There's usually a progression that, in hindsight, contains warning signs. Some of those warning signs were evident in the text messages and social media posts exchanged between the parties in the months leading up to Heather's disappearance. Heather had confided in friends that she was frightened by Tammy's behavior, describing repeated threatening phone calls and encounters that left her feeling unsafe. One particularly chilling exchange came to light during the investigation. In November 2013, just weeks before Heather vanished, she had texted a friend, "I'm scared of what she might do. She told Sidney she would take care of the problem if he wouldn't. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good." The relationship between Sidney and Heather had begun in June 2013 when they both worked at the Tilted Kilt. According to co-workers, the attraction was immediate and intense. Sidney, despite being married with children, pursued Heather aggressively, often staying after his maintenance shifts to talk with her. Their affair continued through the summer months, with the pair meeting at various locations around Myrtle Beach. Sidney reportedly told Heather that his marriage to Tammy was essentially over and that they were staying together only for the sake of their children. This was, according to all available evidence, untrue. The relationship began to unravel in October 2013 when Tammy discovered explicit text messages between Sidney and Heather. What followed was described by witnesses as a campaign of harassment and intimidation directed at Heather. According to testimony from Heather's friends, Tammy began calling Heather repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. She allegedly sent threatening messages and on at least one occasion followed Heather as she drove around town. Sydney, apparently caught between his wife and his girlfriend, began sending mixed messages to Heather, sometimes professing his love, other times telling her to leave him alone. By November 2013, Heather had begun trying to move on from the relationship. She applied for new jobs away from the tilted kilt and started dating other people. Her date with Stephen Schiraldi on December 17th was part of this effort to build a new life. Phone records indicate that after returning home from her date with Stephen, Heather received the fateful call from the payphone at Walmart. What exactly was said during that 4-minute conversation remains unknown, but it apparently motivated Heather to leave her apartment and drive to Peachtree Landing in the middle of the night. One theory proposed by investigators is that Sydney may have told Heather he wanted to meet her to talk without Tammy knowing, using the payphone specifically to avoid creating a record of the call from his cell phone. Another possibility is that he may have claimed there was some emergency that required her immediate attention. Whatever was said during that call, it was persuasive enough to get Heather to drive to a remote location in the early morning hours, a decision that ultimately led to her disappearance. The subsequent phone calls from Heather to Sydney's cell phone between 3:17 a.m. and 3:21 a.m. suggest that she may have arrived at Peachtree Landing and found no one there, prompting her to call him. Alternatively, she may have been calling to tell him she was on her way. Either scenario places her at or near the boat, landing around the time that surveillance cameras captured a vehicle matching the Mora's truck traveling in that direction. What happened at Peachtree Landing remains the central mystery of the case. Without witnesses or forensic evidence, investigators can only theorize about the events that unfolded there. The prosecution's theory, which was persuasive enough to secure kidnapping convictions, suggests that both Sydney and Tammy were present and that they either forced or coerced Heather into their vehicle. From there, the possibilities are grim. The Waccamaw River, which flows past Peachtree Landing, offers an obvious disposal site for a body. The river is deep in places, with strong currents and numerous tributaries and swampy areas along its banks. A body placed in the river, especially if weighted down, could remain hidden indefinitely. Another theory involves the extensive wooded areas surrounding Myrtle Beach. The region contains thousands of acres of forests, wetlands, and remote areas that are rarely visited. A body buried in such a location might never be discovered, particularly if care was taken to conceal the burial site. The investigation into Heather's disappearance was one of the most extensive in Horry County history. In addition to the searches of Peachtree Landing and the surrounding waterways, investigators conducted multiple searches of the Mora's property and vehicles. They analyzed cell phone records, social media accounts, and financial transactions. They interviewed dozens of witnesses and followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. Despite these efforts, certain key pieces of evidence remained elusive. No forensic evidence directly linking the Moras to Heather's disappearance was ever found. No eyewitnesses came forward who had seen the Moras with Heather on the night she vanished. And most critically, Heather's remains were never recovered. This lack of physical evidence was likely a factor in the prosecution's decision to drop the murder charges against the Moras. Under South Carolina law, as in most jurisdictions, murder charges require proof that a death occurred, something difficult to establish conclusively without a body. The kidnapping charges, however, required only proof that the victim was taken against their will or through deception. The circumstantial evidence, the phone records, the video surveillance, the timeline of events, and the Moras' suspicious behavior was sufficient to convince juries of their guilt on this charge. Both Sydney and Tammy Mora are currently serving their 30-year sentences in South Carolina Department of Corrections facilities. Sydney is incarcerated at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, while Tammy is serving her sentence at Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood. Neither has shown any indication of being willing to provide information about Heather's whereabouts. In prison interviews, both have maintained their innocence, suggesting they are victims of a rush to judgment by investigators who focused on them to the exclusion of other potential suspects. This position has remained unchanged despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence presented at their trials. For Heather's family, the convictions provided some measure of justice but little comfort. Without knowing what happened to Heather or where her remains are located, their grief remains in a state of suspension, unable to fully process the loss without the finality that comes with laying a loved one to rest. Morgan Elvis, Heather's sister, expressed this sentiment in a social media post marking the 7th anniversary of Heather's disappearance. People talk about closure like it's something you can just find if you look hard enough. But how do you close a door that's still open? How do you say goodbye to someone when you don't know where they are? We're caught in this terrible in-between place, and that's where the Moores have left us. The impact of Heather's disappearance extends beyond her immediate family. The case has changed the Myrtle Beach community's sense of security and highlighted vulnerabilities that many hadn't considered before. Local businesses and community organizations have responded by implementing additional safety measures and awareness programs. The Tilted Kilt, where both Heather and Sydney had worked, instituted new policies regarding employee relationships and enhanced security measures for staff members leaving late at night. Other restaurants and businesses in the area followed suit, creating a lasting legacy of increased safety consciousness. Local schools and colleges incorporated Heather's story into safety awareness programs, using it as a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of meeting someone alone, especially at night and in remote locations. While these educational efforts are valuable, they also represent a sad reality, that Heather's disappearance has become a warning story for a new generation. The case has also had a significant impact on how missing persons cases are handled in Horry County and throughout South Carolina. Law enforcement agencies have revised their protocols for responding to reports of missing adults, placing greater emphasis on rapid response and comprehensive evidence gathering in the critical early hours. The Find Heather Elvis organization, established by her family, has worked with law enforcement to develop better communication systems for disseminating information about missing persons. They've also advocated for the creation of a specialized missing persons unit within the Horry County Police Department, though budget constraints have thus far prevented this from becoming reality. As the years pass, the chances of finding Heather's remains diminish, but her case remains active. Investigators periodically review the evidence, hoping that advances in forensic technology might reveal something previously overlooked. They also continue to follow up on tips, though these have become less frequent over time. There is also the possibility, however remote, that one of the Moores might eventually decide to reveal what happened to Heather. This sometimes occurs in cases where convicted individuals seek to gain some advantage in the prison system or simply wish to unburden their conscience after years of carrying such a secret. For now, the Waccamaw River continues to flow past Peachtree Landing, carrying its secrets to the sea. The boat ramp where Heather's car was found remains in use, though many locals feel a sense of unease when visiting the site. Some report leaving as quickly as possible, uncomfortable with the knowledge of what may have happened there. The stretch of road between the landing and the Moores' former home in Socastee looks much as it did in December 2013. The businesses whose security cameras captured the black Ford F-150 on its late-night journey continue to operate, most with upgraded surveillance systems, a small but tangible legacy of the case. In Myrtle Beach, life goes on. Tourists still flock to the beaches each summer, largely unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there. New restaurants have replaced the Tilted Kilt, which closed several years after Heather's disappearance. New faces staff these establishments, many too young to remember the case except as a local legend. But for those who knew Heather, her family, her friends, her co-workers, the absence remains acute. They remember her laugh, her ambitions, her kindness. They wonder what she might have become had her life not been cut short. They imagine the career she might have built, the family she might have raised, the difference she might have made in the world. And they continue to hope for answers. Each December 18th, they gather at Peachtree Landing, candles in hand, to remember Heather and to remind the world that their search for the truth continues. They release lanterns that float up into the night sky, carrying messages of love and remembrance. "We will never stop looking for you," Terry Elvis said at the most recent vigil. "We will never stop fighting for justice, and we will never, ever forget." As this case demonstrates, disappearances leave wounds that never fully heal. They create questions that echo through the years, affecting not just those directly involved, but entire communities. The not knowing becomes its own form of torment, a mystery that demands resolution but offers none. For now, the case of Heather Elvis remains one of America's most haunting unsolved disappearances. A young woman who vanished in the night, leaving behind a car, a grieving family, and a community forever changed by her absence. While the legal system has determined who was responsible for her kidnapping, the full truth about what happened to Heather may remain hidden until someone decides to break their silence. Until that day comes, if it ever does, Heather's memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the ongoing efforts to find her and bring her home. Her story serves as a reminder of the fragility of life, the devastating impact of violence, and the enduring human need for truth and closure, even when those things seem forever out of reach.